You've probably heard whispers of the Farnsworth experiments. Most people brush it off as just another wild conspiracy, but for me, it's personal. My dad was one of the scientists on that team, though he rarely talked about it. When he did, his dismissive tone barely masked his unease. The rumors are exaggerated, he'd insist. We tried, we failed. Nothing more to it, but I could tell he hated me bringing it up. His irritation was almost palpable, as if the topic itself weighed on him. Still, my curiosity got the better of me, and one night, after I pushed a little too hard, he finally relented. He told me the basics. It was the mid-'80s, a year or two after I was born, and he was pursuing his PhD in Albany, New York. That's when he got recruited for a government-funded research project. One so secretive it was only known by its code name, Farnsworth. The goal? To test a decades-old hypothesis. If it was correct, time travel wouldn't just be theoretical anymore. It would be real. For nearly a year, the team worked tirelessly. They experimented, theorized, recalibrated, and failed again and again. Eventually, the project was shut down. No deaths, no vanishings, no paranormal activity, just a dead end. Dad claimed the government denied the project's existence out of sheer embarrassment for funding what, in hindsight, seemed like a wild goose chase. It sounded straightforward enough, and I promised not to share the story for his career's sake. After that, I didn't think much about it. Life moved on. College, friends, work. Farnsworth faded into the background of my mind. But then came Thanksgiving of 2006. I drove up to Boston to spend the holiday with Dad. It was just the two of us and my older sister, Kate, a smaller gathering than usual. The meal was uneventful, aside from the usual banter and a shortage of peas, which I didn't miss. Then came the knock. I went to answer the door, not thinking much of it. But when I opened it, the man standing there made my chest tighten. He looked wrong. He was in his 60s, maybe older, with disheveled gray hair and a hollow look in his eyes. His unshaven face twitched slightly as he glanced past me into the house. Before I could speak, Dad appeared behind me. "Bill," he said, his voice wavering, "what are you doing here?" The man stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and shut the door behind him. Dad turned to us, his face pale. "This is Bill Benson," he said. "An old colleague of mine." Bill barely acknowledged me or Kate. Instead, he fixed his bloodshot eyes on Dad. "John, we need to talk." Alone, Dad hesitated, then nodded. In my office, the two of them disappeared down the hallway, leaving Kate and me sitting at the table, our curiosity burning. "Bill Benson," Kate murmured. "I think I remember him. Back in Albany. I was, 5 years old. The longer we waited, the more uneasy I felt. The low murmur of their voices drifted from behind Dad's office door, but we couldn't make out any words. After what felt like forever, Kate stood abruptly. "I have an idea," she whispered, motioning for me to follow her upstairs. We crept into her old bedroom, directly above Dad's office. She pointed to the vent in the corner of the room, and we crouched beside it, straining to hear. Their muffled conversation floated up through the duct. At first, it was technical jargon, oscillations, frequencies, and other terms I didn't understand. Then Bill's voice rose, sharp and frantic. "You can't hide. You have to face the truth." Dad's reply was low, trembling. I'd never heard him sound so nervous. "I don't know why you went back." The words sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could process them, I shifted, hitting my head on a shelf with a loud thud. The room went silent below. Kate and I froze, our breath caught in our throats. Then, we heard footsteps. They weren't in the office anymore. The sound came from the stairs. Slowly, steadily, they were coming up. Dad stepped into view, his face lined with a tension I'd never seen before. "How much did you hear?" he asked. Kate and I exchanged a glance. I hesitated, then replied, We were there for maybe 5 minutes. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Sit down," he said. We returned to the dining table, our footsteps unnervingly loud in the silence. Bill sat too, brushing a stack of old notes off his chair and onto the already cluttered table. Dad remained standing, gripping the back of his chair like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He took a long, shaky breath. "Kate, Robert, I have some things I need to explain." His voice wavered, but he pushed forward. "You know how I've told you I worked on the Farnsworth experiments when you were little? How I said we failed?" He paused, his knuckles whitening. "That was a lie." My stomach turned. "It worked," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Better than we ever could have expected. But there was a problem. A big problem. And now, we don't talk about it. We don't think about it. And we never go back. That's why we left Albany." He glanced at Bill, who sat with his head bowed, his hands trembling slightly. "Bill's problem," Dad continued, "is that he did go back. He shouldn't have. We can't get involved again. For your own good, don't try to dig into this. Live like I do. Like nothing ever happened." His eyes locked on mine, intense and unyielding. "Those of us who ignore the past, we're fine." He drew in another deep breath. "Now, we're gonna eat dessert like nothing happened. And we're going to forget." "Okay." I nodded, though my mind was racing with questions I was too afraid to ask. Bill looked up, his face pale. "I can't just leave it like this," he said, his voice cracking. "I've tried for years, John. We have to find the ones they took. Emily might still be out there. Don't you want to find her?" Dad's face hardened. "My wife is dead," he said coldly. "She died in a car accident." Bill opened his mouth to argue, but Dad cut him off sharply. "If you want to stay for dessert, stay. But if you try to dredge up things that are meant to be forgotten, then you're not welcome in my home." The room went still, the tension suffocating. "I'm sorry, John," Bill finally said, his voice barely audible. He stood, his shoulders slumped, and walked through the adjoining living room. The front door opened, letting in a gust of cold air, then clicked shut behind him. Dad remained silent for a long moment, staring at the table. Finally, he exhaled shakily and said, "I'm sorry you had to see that. There's nothing to worry about. I'll get the pumpkin pie." The pie was served, and we ate in silence, the sound of forks against plates the only noise. Weeks later, after the shock of that night dulled, I gave into curiosity. I started researching Bill Benson. At first, I found nothing. No recent mentions, no updates, like he'd vanished. Then, I stumbled across an old university webpage listing a William C. Benson as a professor. The grainy photo was unmistakably him. Curious, I ran the photo through facial recognition software. It returned 2 matches. The first was old, a group photo from New Year's Eve, 1985. 5 people stood beneath a festive banner. Bill was on the far left, young and clean-shaven, wearing neat street clothes. On the far right were 2 women I didn't recognize. In the center stood my parents. Dad looked nearly the same as he did now. But Mom, I only knew her from photos. My chest tightened as I stared at her face, frozen in a moment of joy. I saved the image, but a cold dread crept over me as I opened the second match. This one was recent. Bill looked older, more haggard, just as he had that Thanksgiving night. His gray hair was unkempt, his face lined with exhaustion. The photo was taken in the dark with a harsh flash, the background a void. But it wasn't the setting that unsettled me. It was the look on Bill's face. His expression was one of pure, unfiltered terror. I closed the image quickly, my pulse racing, and saved it with shaking hands. Both photos came from the same source, a blog. It had only 2 posts, the pictures, and no dates, no context. Whoever created it had disabled comments, leaving behind only an eerie silence. As the weeks turned into months, I tried to forget what I'd seen. But late at night, When the house was quiet, the look in Bill Benson's eyes haunted me. It wasn't the fear of a man running from the past. It was the fear of someone who'd seen it and knew it wasn't done with him yet. Whenever I thought about it, I found myself filled with an unsettling mix of fear and curiosity. The memories lingered like shadows in the back of my mind, but over time, forgetting became easier. Life moved on. I landed a job in Tampa, Florida. Went through 2 relationships. Kate was in New Jersey, buried in her residency at a big hospital. We never spoke about it. I assumed she was trying to forget to. Dad, he acted as though nothing had ever happened. He seemed entirely normal, and I convinced myself it was best to leave it that way. I took up photography during those years, throwing myself into the craft. It became my way of escaping the thoughts that occasionally clawed their way back to the surface. For years passed since that night with Bill Benson. The family reunited for Thanksgiving, and I flew up from Florida to join. This time, it wasn't just us. My aunt, uncle, cousin, and Kate's fiancé had all come too. Walking into that old house felt strange. Nostalgia and unease battled in my chest as memories from that night crept in. I was the last to arrive, and the dining room table, once buried in clutter, now stood perfectly cleared. Dinner was already underway, and I slipped into the only available chair, the same one Bill Benson had occupied years ago. For a moment, an icy sensation crawled up my spine, but it faded as laughter and conversation filled the room. Dad was his usual self, chatting about MIT, his research, and the latest faculty gossip. Occasionally, I thought I caught a slight tremor in his voice, but it was so faint I couldn't be sure. We finished the meal with pumpkin pie, and for the first time in years, I felt at ease. The next day, I flew back to Florida, breathing in the warm, humid air like it was washing away the lingering tension. 2 months later, the phone call came. It was Kate. Her voice was shaking. "Dad's missing." The words felt like a punch to the gut. He hadn't been to work in days. His car was still in the driveway. The house was locked, empty. I flew out immediately. Search parties combed the area. His name, face, thumbprint. Even his retina, nothing came up. Databases, networks, leads, all dead ends. After a month, they called off the search. He was presumed dead, but I knew better. I wanted to tell the police everything, but what could I say? That the Farnsworth experiments had somehow dragged my father into some other reality? That his disappearance was tied to an experiment most would dismiss as a crackpot conspiracy? Instead, I gave them the only lead I had, Bill Benson. I told them he might know something, that he'd been a professor at a local college about 15 years ago, but I couldn't remember which one. They found it, Bridgewater State University. Benson had taught physics and mathematics there for a decade before resigning. After that, nothing. No jobs, no addresses, no records. It was as if he'd vanished off the face of the earth. The only trace they uncovered was an apartment he'd rented 5 years earlier in Albany, New York. But it led nowhere. To them, Bill Benson was a dead end. But I knew better. Dad had gone back, just like Bill. And now, I had to find him. On the icy morning of February 16th, I packed my bag, checked out of my Boston hotel, and scraped frost off my rental car's windshield. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. The drive to Albany was just under 3 hours, but it felt like a lifetime. By the time I arrived, the gray winter sky hung low, threatening snow. I checked into a hotel under a fake name. I didn't know why, it just felt right. Later that day, I drove to the address of Benson's old apartment, my camera slung over my shoulder. The building was old, weathered by time and winters past. The kind of place that seemed to hold secrets in its cracks and crevices. I parked nearby and walked inside. The air was stale, heavy. The main office was dimly lit, with a single desk at its center. Behind it sat a middle-aged woman who looked up at me with tired eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. I have a few questions about someone who used to live here. Her expression hardened. Is this about William Benson? A chill ran down my spine. Yes, I replied. She frowned, crossing her arms. I told the police everything I know. I don't know where he went when he moved out. Her words hung in the air, the finality of them sinking in. But something about her tone, guarded, almost fearful, told me there was more she wasn't saying. Are you a detective? The woman behind the desk asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. No, I replied. I'm John Bowen's son. She paused for a moment, studying me, then gave a small nod. You might try talking to his old neighbors. He lived in apartment 108. The people in 107 still live there. I hope they find your father. Her voice was low, almost reluctant, like she was holding back something more. I thanked her and left the office. The 100s were in the basement. The air grew colder as I descended the short, creaking staircase into a dimly lit hallway. My footsteps echoed faintly against the concrete walls. Apartment 107 wasn't hard to find. I knocked, and the door opened to reveal a couple, probably in their early 30s, a man and a woman who introduced themselves as Kimberly and Al. They didn't seem surprised by my questions, but their answers were vague. They remembered Benson as a bit of a nut, a quiet neighbor, really, someone they exchanged the occasional greeting with but never got to know. As I turned to leave, Kimberly's expression changed, like a memory had struck her. Wait, she said, disappearing into the apartment. A moment later, she returned, carrying a small, taped-shut cardboard box. He told us, she said, her voice hesitant, that if anyone trustworthy came looking for him, to give them this. I took the box, thanked them both, and left. Back in my car, I tore through the tape like a man possessed. Inside was a dusty, outdated cell phone, a photograph, and several sheets of paper covered in dense, scribbled equations. I picked up the photograph first, and my heart stopped. It was a New Year's photo, the same one I had seen on the internet years ago. The faces stared back at me, frozen in time. Memories of that Thanksgiving night flooded my mind. Of Bill Benson, standing in our doorway, of his words that I had tried so hard to forget. I took a deep breath and moved on to the cell phone. Flipping it open, I powered it on. The screen flickered to life, casting an eerie glow in the dim light of the car. The contacts list had only one entry, call. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed a button. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Finally, a voice came through, gravelly and cautious. Who is this? It's Robert Bowen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause. Then, good. Meet me in half an hour at Washington Park. I'll be by the fountain. The line went dead. I gripped the phone tightly, my mind racing. That voice, I knew it. It was Bill Benson. The snow had started falling heavier as I made my way through Albany streets. Washington Park loomed ahead, its skeletal trees casting long, ominous shadows under the streetlights. The fountain came into view, a large, ornate structure now dormant for the winter, its basin filled with snow instead of water. I brushed off a layer of frost from a nearby bench and sat down waiting. 10 minutes passed. Then, through the swirling snow, I saw a figure approaching. It was him. Bill Benson looked even older than the last time I'd seen him. His hair was fully gray, wild and unkempt. Lines etched deep into his face spoke of years of fear and exhaustion. He sat down beside me without a word. For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of snowflakes settling around us. Finally, he broke the silence. Someone came, he murmured, almost to himself. Have you seen my dad? I asked, my voice trembling. He shook his head slowly. No, but I'm trying to find him. Where is he? What happened to him? Bill's expression darkened, and he hesitated before speaking. I don't want you to get involved. I'm sorry I brought you into this. And I'm sorry I pulled John back into it. He was the only one of us who made a clean break. I leaned forward, my desperation spilling out. What happened with the Farnsworth experiments? What is everyone hiding from me? I deserve to know. He looked away, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. It's for your own good that I don't tell you. Do you have the photograph from the box? He asked abruptly. I pulled it out, handing it to him. He studied it with an almost haunted reverence, pointing to each person in turn. Her, he said, pointing to the woman on the far right. Disappeared. His finger moved to the next. Insane. Then disappeared. 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 Oh, and there's me. Still here. Still trying to find them. Not send more off. With that, he abruptly stood. Wait! I called after him. You can't just... But he was already walking away, his figure disappearing into the swirling snow. I snapped a picture of him as he crested a hill, his silhouette fading like a ghost. As I looked down, I saw his footprints in the snow. Without thinking, I began to follow them. I don't know how long I followed those tracks. 10 minutes? An hour? Time seemed to stretch in the silent, frozen landscape. The footprints remained faint, just visible enough to guide me. Then, as I stopped to catch my breath, I realized something. The prints, they didn't end. But they didn't seem to lead anywhere either. They just kept going, faint, fading, and then nothing. I couldn't shake the thought. Bill Benson, a man in his 60s, was easily outpacing me, a 26-year-old. He was moving like someone half his age, or faster. But then another, much more unsettling realization crept in. Washington Park was less than half a square mile. Yet I'd been walking straight for what felt like over a mile. I stopped and looked around. Panic began to set in. I hadn't seen a road, a bench, or even another person in what felt like ages. The snow was lighter now, almost gone, revealing nothing but trees and endless white. I wasn't in the city anymore. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone. No signal. I checked Bill's old cell phone from the box. No signal on that one either. The footprints I'd been following were faint now, nearly vanished, but they were still there. I didn't know what else to do, so I kept walking. After what must have been another 20 minutes, I saw it. The footprints led to a building, an old structure made entirely of weathered sheet metal. It looked like it had been dropped in the middle of nowhere, 2 stories tall with a single door and one small window. A chill ran through me, one that had nothing to do with the cold. I pulled out my camera, snapping a photo of the unsettling structure. The flash reflected harshly off the metal walls, revealing how battered and rusted they were. I walked the perimeter, hoping to find another way in, but there was nothing. Just that single door. My head was pounding now, a sharp pain spreading behind my eyes. I blinked, and suddenly, it was night. I woke up lying in the snow, disoriented and freezing. My head throbbed, and my fingers were so numb I could barely fumble for my phone. The screen read 2:28 a.m. I sat up, the glow from the phone my only source of light. Blood smeared my fingertips as I touched my forehead, and my breath came out in ragged puffs. Panic overtook me. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay here, not like this. I started walking. Every crunch of snow beneath my feet felt deafening in the silence. And every time I paused, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After what felt like hours, a light appeared in the distance. Relief flooded me as I broke into a run, the cold biting at my lungs. I didn't care what it was, a farmhouse, a streetlight. Anything was better than the endless dark. But as I got closer, that relief turned to dread. The light wasn't from a farmhouse or a street lamp. It was the building, the same sheet metal structure I'd seen earlier. Light spilled from the small window, its harsh glow cutting through the night. I froze, staring at it, unsure of what to do. Then, as abruptly as it appeared, the light blinked out. plunging the woods into darkness again. I didn't move. The door creaked open. I held my breath, clutching my phone like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. "Robert, is that you?" The voice was familiar. Bill Benson stepped out, his face illuminated faintly by the moonlight. "Come on, get in before you freeze to death." I hesitated, but the cold won out. Slowly, I followed him inside. The interior of the building was stark, a cavernous room devoid of furniture or decoration. It was strangely warm, though no source of heat was visible. A flight of stairs descended into darkness, while another set led upward. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice echoing faintly. "This was our base in the 80s, Bill replied. His tone was casual, almost too casual. "It's where the experiments happened, the Farnsworth Experiments." "Exactly," he said. "Our lab was downstairs. Not that it matters now. Everything down there has been broken for years." I stared at him, trying to make sense of it all. How did I get here? I was in the middle of the city. Bill hesitated, then shrugged. "It would take me days to explain. Just think of it as a side effect of the experiments." His words didn't comfort me. "Somebody knocked me out," I said, my voice sharpened now. "How do you know we're not in danger?" "I'm sure it was just a tree branch," he said dismissively. "This place has been calm for years. We're safe here." His assurance didn't feel convincing, but I was too cold and exhausted to argue. Slowly, my body began to relax in the warmth of the strange building. "I'll make some coffee," Bill said, gesturing to the stairs leading upward. "You want some?" "Yeah," I replied, watching as he ascended. Minutes passed. My head throbbed, and a sense of unease began creeping back in. I walked over to the base of the stairs, craning my neck to see. At the top, Bill was boiling water on what looked like a wood-burning stove. The soft clinking of metal echoed down the stairwell. Something about the sound, about this entire place, felt wrong. Curiosity overpowered my unease as I walked to the other staircase. I shone my phone's light down, illuminating an old wooden staircase descending into shadows. The faint smell of mildew and something metallic wafted up. I found a light switch on the wall and flicked it. The space below flooded with harsh fluorescent light, revealing a laboratory filled with devices whose purposes I couldn't even begin to guess. The room felt frozen in time. Dust clung to every surface, but the air had a strange stillness, as if it were holding its breath. I stepped cautiously through the lab, the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath me the only sound. At the far end, there was another door. I tried the handle. It turned easily. Flicking on another light, I found myself in a second lab, slightly larger than the first. Machines crowded the space, their buttons and dials eerily dark. My eyes were drawn to a faded banner hanging on the far wall. The letters were barely legible, but I could just make out the words, "Happy New Year, 85. A knot formed in my stomach. On one of the tables, an old notebook lay open, its edges yellowed with age. I hesitated before picking it up and flipping through its pages. Most of the writing was dense, filled with diagrams and technical jargon far beyond my understanding. But then near the end, I found a series of journal entries. The first entries were unremarkable, almost cheerful. The team seemed optimistic, even celebrating with pizza one night. Then the tone shifted. The writing became more sporadic, less focused. Several entries spoke of problems with the oscillators, their frustration bleeding into the pages. Then there was a 3-month gap. The final entry was scrawled hastily, the letters uneven, almost frantic. "We're being watched. I know it. I hate that hole." My blood ran cold. The meaning of that hole was unclear, but the words alone were enough to make my skin crawl. My nerves felt raw, every sound amplified. I wanted to run back upstairs, but first, I needed to document this. I reached for my camera, pulling it from my bag. When I turned it on, the screen flashed, out of memory. Confused, I checked the memory card. It had barely been 7% full earlier. I hadn't taken nearly enough photos to fill it. Then I remembered, I'd blacked out earlier. Or had I? Faint footsteps echoed from above, and my heart jumped. "I've got coffee." Bill's voice called down cheerfully. "Be there in a minute." I shouted back, trying to steady my voice. Ignoring the mounting dread, I began scrolling through the photos on the camera. There was the apartment building where I'd found the box. There was Bill running over the hill. Then the metal building, again and again from different angles. The next set of photos showed me walking back into the woods. Snow, trees, dozens of images, each slightly different. Then one of Bill. He looked furious. My stomach churned. I had no memory of taking these pictures or of Bill's anger. The next images showed us back at the metal building, entering together. "Coffee's getting cold." Bill's voice rang out again, a forced cheerfulness behind it. "I'm almost done," I called, my hands shaking now as I scrolled further. The next images were the building's ground floor. Unlike what I'd just seen, the photos showed the space cluttered with old, decaying furniture. Furniture that wasn't there now. Where had it gone? A chill ran up my spine as I kept scrolling. Photos of the first lab appeared, each machine meticulously documented. Then, images of the second lab, including the faded banner. And then, a photo that made me stop. It showed a door I hadn't seen anywhere in the room. The image file size caught my attention, 15.3 gigabytes. The next photo was taken from farther away, showing the same mysterious door. The file size had grown again. My pulse quickened. The lab felt colder now, as though the air itself were pressing down on me. "Don't stay down there too long," Bill called again, his voice carrying an edge I couldn't ignore. I swallowed hard, my eyes flicking between the photos and the physical space around me. Where was that door? And why wasn't it here now? Then, a photo of Bill appeared on the screen. He was straining, pushing open a heavy door. My camera labeled it as the fourth to last image. My hands trembled as I pressed the button to view the next picture. It was Bill again, but this time, his face was contorted in sheer terror. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized this photo. It was the same image I had stumbled upon online 4 years ago. The background was too dark to discern what was in the third room, but whatever it was, it had horrified him beyond words. "I'll just bring the coffee down to you then." Bill's voice rang out, calm and steady, from 2 rooms away. How could he be calm? How could he say everything was safe after what he'd seen? My fingers shook, but I managed to click to the next picture. It was a hole, deep and endless, plunging into blackness. Just looking at the image filled me with a primal dread, a suffocating certainty that something inhuman was staring back at me from within the void. I felt the presence again, that awful, unseen watching. It was everywhere, in every shadow. My heart pounded as I hit the button to move past it. The camera began loading the final picture. When it appeared on the screen, I froze. My stomach lurched, and bile rose in my throat. It was Bill's lifeless body, lying next to the hole. He was covered in deep gashes and wounds, his blood pooling around him and trickling into the darkness below. His face was twisted into the same expression of terror as in the earlier photo, locked in death. I couldn't breathe. The camera slipped from my grasp, and I ripped the batteries out, as if that could somehow stop what was happening. My mind raced. If Bill Benson was dead, then who had I been talking to for the past few hours? The footsteps grew louder, echoing from the lab. I looked up, my body frozen in terror. The figure in the doorway wasn't Bill. It couldn't be. The form, once so human, now unraveled before my eyes. Gray, ghostly wisps and tendrils swirled together, shifting and writhing, forming something monstrous. And then I saw them. They had been there all along, in the periphery, watching me. More of them emerged, their grotesque forms barely visible, blending with the shadows. They surrounded me, closing in from every direction. I stumbled back, but it was too late. They reached out with countless arms, cold, spectral, horrible. I fought with everything I had, but I was helpless. Their grip was unrelenting, and they began to drag me across the room. I caught a glimpse of where they were taking me. The door. The hole. They pulled me closer and closer to it. The gaping void radiating a suffocating dread. Bill's lifeless body lay just outside, as if to warn me of my fate. I struggled, screamed, thrashed, anything to escape, but their grip never faltered. Then they stopped. I don't know how long I was held there, suspended between terror and exhaustion. Eventually, I passed out. When I woke, I was lying in a field under a pale gray sky. My body was sore, my head pounding, but I was alive. I still feel them watching me. Even now, as I write this, I can feel their presence, always there, just out of sight. It's been 3 years since that night. It's 2016 now. I live a quiet life, under what I can only describe as house arrest. They let me exist, but I'm never truly free. I don't know why they spared me. Perhaps to serve as a warning, or perhaps for reasons I can't comprehend. To anyone reading this, stay away from the Farnsworth experiments. Don't try to find me. Don't try to understand. My name is Robert Lawrence Bowen. I was born in 2084. I'm 29 years old. Dad, if you're out there, take your own advice. Kate, don't come looking for me. That goes for everyone back in Florida. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't let yourself become another victim. The Farnsworth experiments open a door to something we were never meant to find. Something that will never let us go.